Think of the record as a warehouse, not a single file folder. The evidence buckets are the shelves. Before deciding what the project proves, this thesis places each page on the correct shelf, separates the 2007 Mound work from later visitor center projects, and then compares the reviewed plan with the field operation, the discoveries, and the language used to close the file. The question is not whether somebody signed the letter or whether archaeologists were present. Both happened. The question is whether the plans that were reviewed match the excavation that occurred, whether the response to each discovery was covered or formally cured, and whether the final agency language honestly reflects what the project found. This thesis follows that chain one document at a time. Monk's Mound is not a pile of interchangeable dirt. It is a layered record, and some of those layers are original construction, some are slump material, some are ancient additions, and some are modern repairs. The same instability that justified intervention also made every cut archaeologically sensitive. That is why volume alone cannot answer the preservation question. There was authorization, but authorization came in layers. The July letter reviewed effects. The construction contract let the work proceed. A later archaeological permit covered limited coring. Report acceptance and final clearance closed the file. Treating all four as one permit hides the very question this thesis must test. What did each instrument actually cover? The method is deliberately conservative. A missing document means not shown, not never happened. A mapped feature is not automatically an approved feature. A project area is not the same thing as an unlimited depth. By separating those questions, the record can criticize the project where the evidence is strong and leave cells open where the evidence is incomplete. The slope problem was not invented after the fact. It was studied for more than 2 years, and several more invasive solutions were rejected because they would damage the mound. But that long planning period also matters in the other direction. The project had time to define the review package, consult outside experts, and specify what would happen if the field geometry changed. The record shows the study. It does not fully show that decision chain. The northwest corner was in the project. The east slope was in the project. That part is no longer a serious dispute. The open question is depth and method. The letter says, follow the plans. The surviving documents describe shallow benches. The field record describes larger ones. A complete reviewed plan set or a written change approval would connect those two facts. The released file does not yet provide that connection. The field crew did not simply dig and leave. They monitored, stopped work, mapped, photographed, sampled, and produced an important report. But the excavation also grew beyond the shallow concept, and the record does not show that all spoil was screened or that the larger geometry received a new effect finding. The strongest account has to carry both facts at the same time. The excavation did not find an empty mass of meaningless fill. It found how the mound was built, how it failed, how it may have been repaired, and what plants and materials were trapped inside. That scientific result is one of the strongest facts in the record. It also undercuts the broad premise used to describe the slump zone as low risk. The discovery is both the project's greatest contribution and the reason its review chain must be examined closely. A feature can be treated well and still be reached through an unproven depth. A feature can also be reached within the plan and then treated badly. That is why this thesis asks two questions for every discovery. Were they authorized to get there, and were they authorized to do what they did once they found it? Feature 1 shows the value of that separation. The 2007 letter says, in effect, there is a major historic resource here, and this planned repair will not harm it adversely. The 2010 letter says, in effect, there are no significant resources in the project area, while excluding construction discoveries. Those are different statements. The later one cannot erase the features and data in the report accepted a month earlier. The record shows a real emergency, real authorization, real archaeology, real enlargement, and a real close-up contradiction. It does not show a simple villain and victim story. It shows a preservation system that studied the mound carefully but failed to keep every decision connected on paper. The lesson is not, never intervene. The lesson is that intervention at a monument like Monk's Mound must be reviewable in 3 dimensions, in real time, and discovery by discovery. The first step was not interpretation. It was sorting. The consolidated file has 1,447 pages, but 984 of those pages belong mainly to separate entrance, visitor center, fire safety, mechanical, electrical, or later capital projects. I kept those pages in the register so they remain visible, but I did not allow them to prove facts about the 2007 Mound excavation. That leaves 463 stabilization-related pages. This distinction matters because a large file can look comprehensive while still mixing different project numbers, years, buildings, and review pathways. The thesis therefore begins with page control, source hierarchy, and version control before it makes any claim. Monk's Mound is not a historic building. It is a monumental earthwork and archaeological site, designated 11MS38, within one of the most important indigenous cultural landscapes in North America. The mound is more than its exterior silhouette. Its basket loads, clay faces, surfaces, features, plant remains, and repair contacts are the archive. That is why stabilization can preserve the form while also disturbing the information inside it. The classification point is important, but it is not a magic legal answer. It tells us what kind of resource needed to be reviewed, and why building-oriented rehabilitation citation was an imperfect fit. The mound has not been static. Slumps were visible in early historic images, 20th century repairs failed, drains were damaged, the 1988 east fill moved again, and the 2004 and 2005 failures approached the summit. The scientific record also suggests that repair may reach back into the Mississippian period. The first terrace is later than the mound core, and may have buttressed the front slope. A 14th century east slope date may represent a later repair, although its depth is missing. The important point is that original mound and repair fill are not two clean boxes. What stands today is a palimpsest of construction, failure, addition, and maintenance. The engineering emergency was real. Cars and borings found black clay, purged moisture, and multiple silicon sides. A 2-inch rain cut several feet into the head of the east slump, and the geotechnical consultant warned that a summit ravine could grow quickly and damage a much larger portion of the mound. The team considered deep piles, grout, stone columns, shafts, and other options, then rejected them largely because they would penetrate the mound with little archaeological control. At the same time, the 2005 cars already showed multiple failure planes. That advanced knowledge makes the missing contingency and change record especially important. 4 different instruments appear in the file. The July 10 letter was in effect concurrence tied to plans. The CDB contract and authorization let construction proceed. The October permit covered limited soil coring and shows what the dedicated archaeological permit looked like. The December 2009 report acceptance and January 2010 clearance closed later administrative tasks. Calling all of these one permit would blur their different predicates. The review office could approve an undertaking without issuing a coring permit, and it could accept the report without proving that every earlier field change had been reviewed. The paper project included the northwest corner and the east slope. The claim that the northwest corner was absent is contradicted. The best pre-work description called for 1 to 2 foot benches behind the silicon side, archaeological monitoring, separate stockpiling, and clean compacted backfill. Drawings G6 and G7 addressed the 2 localities. The unresolved part is the exact reviewed package. No complete enclosure index, stamped revision set, or reviewer memorandum is authenticated in the release. The letter says to follow the plans, but the complete plans tied to that sentence are not fully preserved in the file we have. The project used a track hoe with a toothless bucket, first at the northwest corner and then on the east slope. The northwest exposure produced 9 faces and 8 benches. The east produced 13 faces. The field team said multiple shear planes cleaved away, forcing 1 to 6 foot benches and cuts extending 1 to 2 meters beyond the main silicon side in places. About 1,500 cubic meters was disturbed, much of it modern 1988 loess, but the intact component was never measured separately. Archaeologists monitored and recorded the work, yet the released file does not show that all spoil was systematically screened. The excavation encountered a real archaeological record. Feature 1 was an upright bald cypress post beside limestone slabs, with pottery and fishbone. Work stopped around it, and the feature was mapped, photographed, covered, and left in place. Feature 7 may have been a post pit with truncated post molds. A 2.5 meter side block feature preserved an ancient turf line. Profiles showed surfaces, mound faces, basket loads, broadcast fails, faulting, and step-like karst deposits. The feature numbers reach 9, but the record also includes contexts that were not numbered as features. That is why the thesis uses a transparent inventory rather than inflating one count. A contemporaneous correspondence claim of displaced post material and the SON, retained post section is registered at A05. Whether it describes feature 1, a separate context, or a misreport is an unresolved treatment question under the Chapter 9 access versus treatment test. The contemporaneous stop-around feature record regist. ERDAT-AB04 corroborates the documented treatment and leaves that question open. The scientific yield was exceptional. The record combines 24 main radiocarbon determinations, 4 direct east slope assays, 4 continuous cores, 4 borings, flotation, micromorphology, wood identification, and a large profile sequence. The mound core clusters in the 11th century. First terrace dates are later. One modern date lies above the east failure plane, and likely dates modern repair fill. The side block laboratories dated different plant fractions, not one uniform event. Annual weeds and quillwort survived because fill was sealed rapidly, and wetland taxa point toward lowland borrow sources. These data make the project scientifically valuable while also proving that the fill was archaeologically informative. The controversy was mainly archaeologists arguing with archaeologists. Critics objected to unscreened machine excavation, intact deposits, lack of transparency, and lack of consultation. Defenders pointed to the slope danger, rejected alternatives, modern fill, stop work authority, and extensive documentation. The most important institutional evidence came from the agency itself. The deputy SHPO said she was shocked by the photograph and had not understood the work, and the project defense conceded that broader professional consultation had not occurred for about 2 decades. The record never commissioned an independent assessment to decide the severe damage claim. In December 2009, IAP accepted the archaeological report. In January 2010, IAP issued a letter saying no significant resources were present within the proposed project area. The same letter excluded discoveries during construction. Those statements cannot be used as one continuous factual narrative. The 2007 letter assumed a major resource and found the planned effect non-adverse. The 2010 form appears to use boilerplate or an administratively narrowed area. That contradiction undermines the later letter as a factual summary, but it does not prove intentional concealment. The thesis identifies records that could change its conclusions. A stamped July review set could prove that the larger geometry was anticipated. A field directive or change order could show contemporaneous cure. Screening logs could establish how spoil was handled. A borrow clearance could close the clean fill question. An independent condition assessment could evaluate damage. Original field notes could give WS 586 a depth. Consultation files could show whether descendant communities were contacted outside the released email chain. Naming those records makes the thesis falsifiable rather than rhetorical. The exclusion bucket is not discarded evidence. It is controlled evidence. Later visitor center and mechanical/electrical records may be useful for the history of the site, museum closure, or facility management, but they do not prove what was reviewed or excavated in 2007. The full-page register retains every excluded page and states why it is excluded. That protects the thesis from accidental contamination and lets a future researcher reassign a page if a direct link is discovered. The chronology shows 2 different tempos, a 31-month design and study period, followed by field controversy that developed after the excavation was already near completion. That contrast explains why the engineering case can be well developed while the consultation and field change record remains incomplete. The curves show why the slope moved and why the excavation became difficult. A thin black clay bed held several slickened sides, not one clean plane. The same data also gave advance warning that a one-size-fits-all bench might fail in the field. The missing question is whether that warning was converted into a reviewed contingency before the contract work began. The 2 theses are not competing documents anymore. The larger thesis supplies the audited administrative record. The shorter draft adds historical recognition, earthen architecture theory, craft and artifact context, proven discussions, alternative viewpoints, and the rules for handling speculative material. Repetition has been removed, unique evidence remains visible and graded. The brochure presents the state's older public story of Cahokia, a large urban center, a monumental fortress mound, elite burials, calendars, walls, houses, exchange, and eventual decline. The thesis preserves that story as a dated interpretive layer. It is evidence of how Cahokia was explained, not an automatic answer to what the latest archaeology proves. The website is not one kind of evidence. It is a cabinet containing catalog cards, newspaper extracts, dimensions, personal observations, public protest, family engineering advice, native tradition comparisons, and far-reaching diffusionist theories. This appendix keeps the cabinet intact, but labels every drawer. The administrative thesis rests on authenticated records. The website contributes provenance leads, historiography, and questions to test. Revision 3.1 does not replace the thesis with a new argument. It tightens the measurements, corrects the screening question, adds the earlier state precedent, restores the historic first terrace layer, and places the interpretive images behind an explicit evidence boundary. The record does not contain one negative finding. It contains two different findings that contradict each other. The effects inventory shows what was physically altered, what resources were present, and where the administrative chain remains open. The legal conclusion is calibrated. The factual contradiction is not. The new volume model does not pretend to be an as-built survey. It shows that the earlier 1,500 cubic meter total was too low, that 2,400 cubic meters fits the measured envelope, and that the amount of original mound removed cannot be fixed until the missing quantity and section records are found. The 1980s state response proves that doing nothing was not the same as doing nothing carefully. Passive management was paired with research, consultation, and monitoring. The 2007 project chose a different path, but future work can still recover the earlier discipline. Diagnose, consult, document, use compatible repair, and keep watching after the equipment leaves. Monk's Mound did not stop being important after the Mississippian period. On the first terrace, Cahokia families and the French chapel formed a short-lived 18th century community. The cemetery and artifacts make this a living history and descendant community issue, not only a construction history issue. The images are useful because they make a hypothesis visible and reproducible. They're not a photograph of the past. The thesis preserves the design work, the palettes, and the file manifest while keeping cultural attribution and ancient application in the open question bucket. Version 5.0 now tells one controlled story across the Mississippian Mound, the 18th century Cahokia and French mission landscape, the 1980s passive management precedent, the 2007 stabilization, the later close-up contradiction, and the modern interpretive visual package. It preserves the strongest data from both versions while keeping administrative evidence, archaeology, comparative conservation, and interpretation in separate evidentiary lanes.